welcome to this TUKFS Connect event on rethinking the urban food supply chain to ensure access and affordability. And we're going to hear today about research that's exploring emerging opportunities to strengthen coordination across fresh produce wholesale markets and surplus food distribution networks. We're going to hear first from Professor Jagjit Singh Srai and his team. So Jagjit is the head of the Centre for International Manufacturing, which is part of the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. His research group works closely with industry in the analysis, design and operation of international production, supply and service networks. Jag has previous roles in industry before he joined Cambridge in 2003 and has worked as a manufacturing and supply chain director of a multinational operation and a technical director of a national business. So he's also a chartered engineer. So Jag, over to you, and please tell us a bit more about your work and introduce us to our team members as we go along. Okay, if you want to share some slides.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for the introduction, and we'll just put up our slides from our end. Let's make sure that comes through okay. And we'll just let that go through into screen presentation mode. Fantastic, that's great. So we're giving a short talk around reinventing the role of fresh produce wholesale markets in urban food systems, and it builds on quite a number of projects, part of the Transforming UK Food Systems programme, and also related programmes on resilience in food systems. So I'm just going to have the pleasure of introducing the team on the next slide. A number of projects are informing the work that we're going to present. The most recent project is called Project Rascals, and hence why the title is Meet the Rascals at our Centre for International Manufacturing. I myself am a Professor of Research in the Department of Engineering, and I head up the centre, but I also co-chair the Global Food Systems Interdisciplinary Research Centre in Cambridge, and you see that logo at the bottom left. The projects I referred to were Project Mandala, which is a consortium looking at urban food systems. We're drawing on lots of connections with Project TIGR2ESS, which was a very major program in reconfiguring food supply chains. And finally, Project Rascal, which is about the resilience of agri-food supply chains. So the team that will be presenting today will be my colleague Ettore Settanni, Assistant Research Professor in our centre, and Nikolai Kazantsev, who's our Research Associate. And part of the team is also Chao Chen Feng, just on maternity leave. Hope to see her back soon. And Aaron, who's part of our doctoral student team, but also looking on food systems. So just a quick introduction to the team, and then I'm going to pass on to Ettore, talk a little bit about the background around our work before Nikolai digs into some of the analysis we've been undertaking. Over to you, Ettore.
Oh, that's brilliant. I have to sorry, just audio settings to go through as it's bound to happen. Did you turn on your mic? Can you hear me okay? Sorry, just a bit of a call.
Yeah, that sounds better now. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. Too many computers. They are outnumbering us as humans, but that's a different presentation. So today, as Jag mentioned, is a 3 acts, and I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of the due diligence and the perhaps the macro perspective on the wholesaling landscape, fresh produce wholesaling. Then we'll pass it on to Nikolai regarding the development strategy and modeling aspects, as well as the preliminary fundings, and then pass it back on to Jag to close off. So as mentioned, there are three aspects that I would like to just introduce you to, starting from how we've been engaging with stakeholder along the agri-food supply chain as part of the Project RASC2AL and Mandala, and how that led us to build quite a strategic collaboration with Birmingham Wholesale Market, which is one of the largest integrating markets in Europe for fresh produce. And a slightly provocative and counterintuitive perspective, is it just a declining type of business we should not bother ourselves to look into, or is it a catalyst and perhaps a underplayed actor whose importance kind of comes up at time of need? For instance, when where we have shortages like in COVID and stuff. But I'm giving too much away, but you probably can see where the answer is. And then hand over with some open challenge and opportunity that then will lead into why do we take the approach we take that Nikolai will walk us through. So as I mentioned, we could have pulled up any sort of picture about the food supply chain, but I wanted to start from one of our real conversation we've been having with supply chain actors that the team with me has been engaging with at the last Cambridge International Manufacturing Symposium, which usually takes place in September here in Cambridge. I'm pretty sure that Jag will spend a word about that and the closure. With a lovely food resilience workshop, but that included, as you notice, from left to right, your major actors in agritech and trade and wholesaling, including senior executives from Dole and the director of Birmingham Wholesale Market company that will come up later as well as key processors and distributors from large multinational like Unilever all the way to big players in the UK like Sandwich Brothers. And then I know colleagues will also touch on the topic of food surplus. Well, we had the president of the Lost Food Project, which is also a leading academic, former MIT and now Azure Business School, Charles Fernandez, was a keynote and also dubbed as a broad perspective on food surplus charities, and especially a large one. And then as you see on the layer at the bottom, as we always do in our center, we don't just map unit operation along the supply chain, but we actually look at stakeholders. And you see we had a large intervention, a large participation from technology and policy stakeholders who are interested in the food supply chain, whether that's agri-tech technology like NIAB or Digital Catapult, which bring up the digital technology perspective, or large European research projects like one of the former directors of VIT Food, and of course the Cambridge Global Food Security, which Jag has co-chaired for some years, and is an important forum to bring the food supply chain into perspective when it comes to food security. So great event, very enriching conversation, and I guess we were anticipating some green literature summary of this to come up shortly. But this is the supply chain the way we see it. It's made of different stakeholders. It's a make of interaction between policy and technology, as well as the classic unit operation, and also looks in places that we normally don't look, which have to do with surplus food and the social aspect more broadly. Now, I mentioned that the director of Birmingham Wholesale Market will come up later, and here it is. So Eddie has been a great collaborator in both Project Mandala and RASC2AL for us, and we had the good fortune of spending some time in the Birmingham Wholesale Market interacting with traders as well as with the management team. More on that later when Nikolai will explain the models. But this quote that has been dug out is quite telling, because as you notice, Eddie has described the wholesale market as the world's pantry. And indeed, there is a perception that mature businesses like the wholesale or fresh produce wholesaling are perhaps something we shouldn't be worried about. And yet, at time of need, so this kind of put them under the radar. But at time of need, that's where they become prominent, the worst pantry. So the role of the wholesale market is to guarantee accessible and sustainable and affordable access to fresh food has been systematically underplayed, as you can tell from this quote. And so a lot of the modeling that's been going on, a lot of the formalizing of the strategic formalizing support by modeling that's going on in our group has been trying to elevate the role of the wholesale market from underplayed, unsung hero of the urban food system supply chain to something perhaps more recognized and perhaps reinvented that needs to be supported in their innovation strategy. But more on that later. So I told you that my role here is just to introduce you a little bit on the background. I tend to bring a macroeconomic view on things. So I like freely available data. And again, we couldn't pull up any type of so-and-so say, here are how many wholesale markets. But I wanted to show you a couple of things. So I couldn't resist by crawling the whole Companies House records to actually figure out how many fresh produce wholesalers are there in the UK and how many of them actually are co-located in wholesale markets. This is a major point I want to make, and that's very important for our research. So we could count the establishment, and that's the left-hand side figure. I searched them by SIC code, so that's just, remember, wholesale of fruit and vegetables, so no meat and fish and things like that. But the sector is worth, alone in the UK, 11 billion. So it's not little, and there are almost 5K establishments that operate not necessarily as wholesale markets. Now, this is very important. You see on the left, this is where the fresh produce, whether locally grown or imported, transit. And we will show later that's about 30% of the sales of fresh produce actually is through wholesale markets. But on the right, where you see the co-location aspect, the fact that some of those traders co-locate in a wholesale market, that opens up a number of questions around why would they? You know, as academics, we're interested in thinking about network externalities. Is there, we could call it flywheel effect or enforcing aspects of being co-located? Is there something that brings about an advantage of being co-located? And there will be some of that coming up as we show some of the models, but this is not a trivial aspect. You could be a wholesaler and be, you know, at the back of your garage or wherever. You don't need to be in a wholesale market. And some of the trends that we're going to unpick actually speak to that story. Specifically, as I mentioned, it's nice to put side to side two trends. On the left, the UK fresh produce availability or total supply, so production plus imports and export. And so if you look at the DEFRA statistics between 2016 and 2024, you could argue there is a slightly declining trend. And so that's quite interesting because, of course, demand and demand signal and how that's projected plays an important role in our conversation. If people don't consume fresh food through the urban food system, you always hear about food deserts and so on and so forth. Then, of course, what would be the role of having viable wholesale markets? Also, you can see that the incidence on imports is quite high for fruit. It's in the region on average 85%. So if you make a ratio of imports over the total supply is 80%. For vegetables is in the region of almost 50%. So we're talking about quite an important international trade actor, considering especially for fruit and vegetables. And so quite a key element in international manufacturing and trade networks, which actually speaks to our expertise. But now take a look on the right. On the right, we're talking about how much of that trade transits through wholesale markets, and that's quite a staggering 30% of UK fresh produce sales, according to NABMA estimates. And now there is a problem though. We also troll a number of industry reports to understand what is the situation, how many wholesale markets are there. The picture I showed you earlier kind of features around 13 just for fruit and veg. That doesn't tell you the whole story. But actually, one staggering things come up. The latest estimate is 17, so I was not too far off. But in the 90s, there were 34. So this means that the number of wholesale market in the UK has halved over 25 years. Now, is it a decline? Is it just an organic restructuring of the channels? The 90s is also the time where the Strathclyde report on wholesale market came up, actually bringing about some prediction around organic restructuring of the retail wholesaler in the UK. So Nikolai will elaborate a little bit more about where this trend is leading us. But one thing that Nikolai brought to our attention was actually it has been in the news in the last a year or so ago, just a few years ago, that actually Smithfield and Billingsgate, to two more wholesale markets, are facing permanent closure in London as there's been withdrawn support and been talk of relocation. And so this is a continuing declining trend. And so the viability of the traders, it's on the map. It's an important topic that we're talking about today. Now, before handing over to Nikolai and talking models and talking how do we support, so you hopefully you see why talking strategy is important and why we use modeling tools to support that. But before entering that, it's important to sum up in terms of opportunities and challenges. So I want to start with the glass as half full. So wholesale markets are the unsung hero of urban food systems in the UK. They provide a capacity buffer when high street chains are disrupted, from COVID, but actually reports as far back as 2011 were already trying to bring to the map, raise awareness of this role in this most likely linked to food security. But it's interesting that it took 80 years for that to become more evident. It's not all gloomy. There are growth opportunities estimated by market intelligence to be around 1.7 per annum, but they are driven by health consciousness and organic produce. So there's a consumer choice and a demand aspect to it, and Nikolai will elaborate on that later. And of course, along with variety of choice for growing diaspora communities in Birmingham as well as somewhere else. And believe me or not, the ability to keep your enemy closer. So, develop synergies with digital disruptors like dark kitchens and new actors that actually are perceived as a threat by traders, conventional traders. And not last, the opportunity to reduce waste, which is one of the highest operational costs for traders, setting at around 30,000 tons per year. So again, one of the models that we've been looking at actually also touch on this. But of course, there are challenges, and it's not news that supermarkets have been increasingly bypassing wholesalers. So it has been a channel restructuring in the background story where, food service intermediaries like Bitfood and others tend to be preferred. And so we cannot ignore that. So some of it is organic and happening and structural. There is a very well-defined perception that in an advanced economy, the market share of wholesale markets will are bound to decline. And so you will hear from Nikolai about reinvention and new business model opportunities in there. And sadly, there is also a consumer angle where there is an overall struggle to actually meet the 5 days diet recommendation in the UK, and therefore more generally a little bit of a decline in fresh produce consumption. And last but not least, this is not a high margin business, and believe it or not, there is a very tight connection between city councils making real estate decisions around the estate that is occupied by wholesale markets. So on one hand, there's an advantage of being co-located. On the other hand, city councils kind of squeeze too much rental from business that make 4% margin. And so oftentimes we see in the news, and if you check those news about the Billingsgate market, there are often conversations on relocation and kicking off traders somewhere else or just closing them down. So that's quite important. You will see again, maybe Nikolai talking about that in the moment. So now we get into the gist of it. And I guess, Nikolai, you want me to maybe touch on the general framework and then you will take over, right? So you are stuck with me for one more slide and then I will leave it alone, I promise. So how do we academically approach, given this context, the project, the problem-informing development strategy for wholesale markets through intervention-based research? Again, I'm giving away too much, but let me kind of elaborate a bit about what intervention-based research is. This is academies for challenging current state and the theoretical underpinning that explains how things are could be by doing research that is slightly different from an intervention research as you understand it, maybe in medical research or population health research. So let me walk you through that in a second. So we are design driven, and so there's the key point is identifying issues and co-develop intervention. So you see in the current state, you might spot some of us on the line hanging around with the traders and trying to understand the current state, map it out, and co-develop design propositions. Maybe get a few mangoes along the way. Some of us, know me. Then, of course, the hard and thankless work of develop models and collect data that can enable empirical-based theory development. So put it to the test. Now, this is where my artistic skill come to handy. So for instance, you might hear us talk about rethinking wholesale markets as B2B platforms. And what that means, we'd like to investigate network externalities that might explain why it makes sense to co-locate on one side of the wholesale market as tenants, or maybe on the other side, whether that's a new type of demand like dark kitchens, or perhaps more traditional demand channels. And so could we observe behavior that is explained by those externalities? Now, that's the theoretical framing. And then develop the co-design intervention that maybe allow us to emphasize scenarios that are pragmatically valid, but at the same time strategically relevant. So you see here two envisioned scenario. One is keep your enemy closer. And so, for instance, how about establishing new channels with the much loathed digital disruptors, or maybe bring more screen, or there's maybe a digital flavor and digital reinvention and on the service offering of the wholesale market. So I hope it makes sense, this background and a little bit of the underpinning. But now over to Nikolai to talk about how this actually look like.
Thank you, Ettore. Indeed, because of very close proximity to trader tenants of the wholesale market, to the management of the wholesale market, to the other participants of the food system, we're able to execute an approach which has three main steps. So first of all, we map the position of the wholesale market inside of the food system. You might recall the workshop which Ettore has shown on his second slide, where we actually brought in one room participants of the food system. So maybe many of them for the first time actually met participants which are also working together with them on food accessibility. So here, by using workshop interviews and stakeholder engagement, we try to be as close to the problem as possible. By doing that, we develop interventions. Interventions are sometimes policy changes, sometimes strategic changes, which change the status quo in the system and time. Again, this is all discussed with participant directors. We use not only literature reviews and secondary data collection, although there's lots of secondary data and open data about performance of all the actors in the food system. We always validate it in the field. And then finally, we do system dynamics models, which the method called collaborative or group model building, including these stakeholders, explain to them how specific actions can trigger changes immediately in short-term perspective and in mid and long-term perspective. So that actually gives a strategy, some data-driven, evidence-driven angle, because you can play out scenarios how you market, how your system can develop.
Is the slide still on? Sorry, it looks like we lost the slide.
They just dropped.
I don't know why. Sorry. We're back.
You're back.
We're back to track. And on the right side of the screen, you might see the logo of System Dynamics Society. I'm a proud member of this society for the last 6 years. That's me with Professor John Sterman, one of the founders of it at MIT last year. Society is very open for new ideas where system dynamics can play out, and actually some of these models have been showcased, and they were widely and very warmly accepted. Moving to the next slide, please. So the first model shows us the vision of the management of a number of wholesale markets who are interested in increasing number of tenants. So tenants bring tenancy fees, they increase occupancy, they create what they call vibrant markets. So the market which has lots of offers, lots of offerings. So you have number of tenants bringing products and consumers value that. So this is the archetype of that model is called goal-seeking behavior. So we have here in the center the number of tenants as a stock, so the value which accumulates in time. So so you have here desired number of tenants, so the number of trader tenants you want to see on the market, and the current number which is inside of the stock. And then you have discrepancy, so the difference and you need to do some corrective actions, which have incurred costs that either improve the average duration of tenancy of the current tenants or attract more tenants to come. That's the very simple model that shows that we have been discussing firstly with the management of wholesale market, trying to elaborate on the let's say the visible aspect of strategy. But what this model doesn't show, this model doesn't show what kind of tenants are coming. So if we see the developments of smaller markets, let's take any market in an English town. Sometimes you see, for example, in Cambridge, the traditional fresh produce market on the central square now has been replaced by traders or by sellers who actually sell things that are more popular. So you see lots of touristic goods being sold. You might imagine a barber shop, you might imagine a gym, you might imagine anything which has a very smaller connection to actually food and fresh produce. Moving to the next slide, please. So that actually executes another archetype, which is called the co-flow, a very important feature for our research, which is a fresh produce sourcing volume, which is dependent on the tenants' arrival rate. So we're interested in not the number of tenants per se, which is a very important metric for the management of the wholesale market. But for us, what we want to trace is actually how much food, how much fresh produce we're able to bring, because this volume of food can actually help us to sustain disruptions. So Ettore shortly mentioned the role of capacity buffer, right? And this role was prominent during COVID-19. So when if you remember, supermarket shelves completely empty out of some fruits and veg, that's a real case. People came to wholesale market because wholesale market had an additional source of fresh produce. So in this case, we can actually trace the feature which is interesting for us, the fresh produce sourcing volume. Going to the next, please. Yeah, and then going what the previous model hasn't considered. It considered generally volume of fresh food, but what is it? What is inside? Are they only fresh carrots, or are they only fresh potatoes? Right. So if we try to bring strategy angle here, we start thinking about complementarities between product components. It can be not only the growing segment. So this slide shows us market of the diversification as the first intervention. So it can be, for example, the growing segment, the diaspora around wholesale market, who is looking for specific goods, and that's why they go to cash and carry instead of wholesale market, right? That's a very direct thing, but it also can be complementary products which can trigger more customer groups coming. Next slide, please. And then having this having the variety and volumes of food upon the market, we can start thinking what we call the green banana. So between our group, we call it banana model, because you will see there will be number of bananas grown on the right side of the chart. So the first green banana implies that we increase the volume of fresh produce, which is complementary to each other. And here we can play out, for example, by adding sorting, packaging, delivery facilities on behalf of the wholesale market. So it means that not the tenant is delivering food from their own shelves, but the wholesale market aggregates the necessary pack to unlock more demand in the region. So here they can introduce their own brand, for example, local fresh produce. They can elaborate collaboration with potential B2B channels such as dark kitchens. It can enable more demand, which doesn't exist yet because we simply haven't linked these volumes of fresh produce to the current need of cooked food. Next slide, please. Then we have orange banana. Orange banana inevitably happens because the more fresh produce we bring to the market, the more surplus we get. And unless we have a sorting capability to identify, to actually sort out things that is about to expire, we would face what we see at the moment. Lots of tenants who are being pushed what about surplus of your production? For them, it's easier to donate the actually good food which can be sold, but then to kind of invest into trying to find out a couple of apples from a huge batch, which really needs to be donated. So here we want to go beyond donation. We want to identify the parts of the products which can be still processed into canned food, and again, it can be sold using the brand of the wholesale market.
Can we just give maybe then Jag the chance to close off, because I guess we've been given 5 minutes.
Of course,
this maybe just
this is the last slide. Yeah, so then the final model actually matches on the fact that if we again increase everything, we'll inevitably increase waste in the market. So, and unless we provide waste separation services, we actually put to the tenants the need, the risk of paying penalties, and by paying penalties they reduce profitability, and again that reduces the intention to stay in the market.
So there are a few more slides, but we'll skip and maybe Jag, if we could rope you back in to just offer some final thoughts. So I mean, apologies for overrunning a little bit. We get carried away easily. So Jag, I mean, would you like to close off?
Yeah. I'll do that, and apologies for any background noise I think some may have been getting from our machine. Just to summarise, fresh produce challenges and opportunities are really seeing a decline in the presence of wholesale markets. We're seeing this is a major concern that we need to revitalise, reinvent the market. I think the real novelty about what we're presenting today is really that we're using we've got a strategy refresh agenda. It's okay. We've got a strategy refresh agenda, and we're using our intervention-based research, a very formal process to look at strategy interventions. And we're very fortunate that Birmingham Wholesale Markets is allowing us to co-create that with them. Current and future state analysis is identifying some really interesting interventions and complexities. Some of them are counterintuitive outcomes. And what we've got in terms of future work is ways to really drive strategy adoption. So can our analysis inform things they should prioritise at the wholesale market, and in a generalised sense across wholesale markets in urban contexts. So thank you for listening. Apologies for overrunning slightly. Back to you, Tracey.
Thank you, Jag, and thanks, Ettore and Nikolai, for your insights on that. So we'll move quickly on we have another project we're delighted to share with you today. We're first going to hear from Carol Wagstaff, who's Professor of Crop Quality for Health at the University of Reading, and Carol is here because she's the principal investigator of the Food Systems Equality Project, FoodSEqual for short, which includes the work stream on food redistribution networks that's led by Professor Michael Boulakis at Cranfield University. Michael wasn't able to join us for the whole session, so we're tag teaming today, but thanks for Carol for stepping in, and Michael will hopefully be with us shortly. So Carol, we can toggle on your slides, and please introduce this work. If we make it whole screen, Russo.
Okay, perfect. I think whilst that's just coming through and all our computers are catching up. Thank you. You've done most of the introduction for me, I think, Tracey. So yeah, I'm from the University of Reading. It's my privilege to lead FoodSEqual. And this collaboration with Cranfield is one part of FoodSEqual, but one that's been really insightful around surplus food redistribution, and how supply chain networks could be adjusted, regulated, and so on, to work more effectively. And we started from the principle, as many will know, FoodSEqual focuses on food systems for disadvantaged people. And all too often, particularly in fresh produce, the food that they have available to them is very much end of life, because the current supply chain networks servicing the food aid system leave something to be desired. So Michael will join us a little later on, and he's been leading this work from Cranfield. Most of the presentation is going to be given by Rusudan Gongladze, who's going to start us off, who's still based at Cranfield, and Emmanuel Sawyerr, who did the bulk of the work at Cranfield, but has recently taken up a post at the University of Glasgow, and we're delighted to be able to keep collaborating with him. So Rusa, over to you.
Yeah, I'll start, and then once I'm done, I'll hand over to Rusa. So I think we would want to start with the broader problem or the background to how we decided to approach this study. And there is this wicked problem of food loss and waste and food insecurity. So there are some who hold the position that the problems are distinct and are not actually connected to each other. But I think it will be difficult for us to see how we have enough food production. There is enough food to feed the whole world, and still there are a lot of people who are hungry. So clearly there is a problem, and there is some level of connection between the two situations that require attention. And as some of the figures that we present on the screen show, 40% of the food that is produced globally is lost or wasted at some point. And yet we have hundreds of millions of people globally who do not have access to good, healthy food. And not to mention the adverse environmental impact that surplus food has because of how it's not utilized properly. At the same time, within the UK, the same story is true. We have vast majority of the food or significantly large volumes of food produced in the UK that is going to waste according to rough estimates. And yet we still have huge volumes in terms of value of money that is being lost in wasted food, whilst 11% of the UK population is living in food insecure household. About 70%, I think at the last estimate of these are children. And so there is a problem within the UK that, well, globally, but also more significantly in the UK, that requires our attention and finding some solution to what the situation is. Now, the UK government has adopted the waste hierarchy that has been applied within the food system, the food waste hierarchy. But obviously, the first step is to prevent the wastage of food. But as most of us here on this platform are probably aware, there is some level of unavoidable surplus generation that something has to be done with them. Now, the prescription has been that if food waste cannot be prevented or food loss cannot be prevented, the next step is for it to be redistributed for human consumption before the other options are explored, such as animal feed recycling and all the other repurposing options. But this has not been the case, as again, some of us might attest to, that quite huge volumes of the surplus food that are produced or available in the UK ends up in other streams of usage, like anaerobic digestion. Unfortunately, some do end up on landfills and other places as such, and we are not getting enough of this food consumed by humans. So for our study, we decided that if there is unpreventable surplus, we want to zoom into the redistribution stage and look at how we can get the surplus food that is available consumed. And we adopted a supply chain, logistics supply chain perspective, and more specifically looking at the network and looking at ways that we can look at the issues there and find some of the solutions that we can adopt to address some of these issues. Risa, if you can go into the next slide for me. And so looking a little bit more detailed into what the redistribution stage means, I'll just spend just a couple of minutes here, about 30 seconds here. The point being that at the redistribution stage, the first type of option that actors in the commercial food supply chain are supposed to do are supposed to look at, alternatives such as viable or economic alternatives such as price reduction, repackaging, remanufacturing, or reuse in kitchens. Some of the options indeed that our colleagues from Cambridge had hinted on or touched on. And if that is not possible, then you could look again at a relatively lower economic option, such as the commercial redistribution options, some of the food that end up on some of our known wholesale markets where they tend to be graded as lower grade foods, but are redistributed commercially. But if that is also not possible, then there has to be commercial charitable redistribution, again, which is where our study decided to focus, because we were trying to see the link between how, if we optimize the logistics and supply chain operations, we could ensure that those who are food insecure and currently are reliant on surplus food redistribution, charitable surplus food redistribution, can get the most value in terms of the food quality, the volumes and variety of surplus that is redistributed. Can we look at the next slide, please? Right, so this is where surplus food redistribution comes in. And again, giving you some of the numbers that are reported, especially by RAP, with regards to how much volumes of food are redistributed in the UK. So you can see that almost 800,000 tons of food was redistributed between 2015 and 2023, which is not much if you look at how much more we could do, but there has been consistent improvement over time. But there is much more that can actually be done in terms of how much more food that can be saved. And this does not even capture part of the problem in terms of, for instance, FoodRise's recent report about how much workers in the charity sector are complaining about some of the quality of food that they end up having, and significant portions of which they can't actually use. Now, that is clearly a problem that needs addressing. At the same time, there is a challenge with the quality or the capacity of some of the charity organizations that we call the consumer-facing organizations. So in the charity sector, we can basically group them into two groups. There's the wholesale distributors, which our next slide will kind of show us the type of organizations that we're talking about. And there are the smaller charities, which are the consumer-facing organizations. And there are a wide variety of these organizations. Here's where the food banks will fall in, community cafes, schools, and all of those types of organizations. And there is a lot of complaints on the consumer-facing side of things, of sometimes the quality of food that they end up having. But we do know that there is good quality in the commercial food supply chain. But how do we move most of that good quality food into the charitable sector to ensure that those who currently are dependent on those channels get good quality, dignifiable food to eat, right? Whilst those who believe there are other alternatives or perhaps more long-term solutions, perhaps from a political economic perspective, are looking at those solutions. How do we ensure that currently the good available food can be sent to those in need and have them addressed? So we adopted a network perspective at addressing this, and you would realize, as I will later on hand over to Rusa, she would highlight how the wholesale redistributors tend to be at the center of all of this. And if we address issues in that space, we could help improve the quality and volumes of food that end up to the disadvantaged consumer. So in the next slide, I'll just mention or provide the names of some of the large organizations that are involved in the wholesale redistribution sector. And we know of Fair Share, or at least I hope most of us are aware of Fair Share, who handle significant volumes of food and redistribute them. There is also the Company Shop Group, who adopt a mix of the commercial and the charitable approach to work. We have the likes of the Phyllis Project. Risa, if you can just move on for the full slide. We have the Phyllis Project, who are also a significant actor in that space. Likewise, the Bread and Butter thing, who operates in the mid to northern part of England. And then we have Neighbourly and similar other digital brokers or digital platforms that help connect, the business sector sometimes to consumer or to the charity side of things. So in the next few slides, Rusa is going to dig a little bit deeper into our work, looking at a network perspective and what some of the issues in terms of access resources and activities play into some of the issues that plague the sector, and how we can adopt digital technologies into addressing some of these issues. Rusa, I hand over to you at this point.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Let me just go into the presentation mode. All right, thank you very much. So let me just now quickly take you through the surplus food flows in the charitable surplus food redistribution. This is based on this. This is a simplified version of these flows and based on the literature insights as well as our empirical study. Majority of surplus is rescued from farm to hospitality sector by the food wholesale redistributors, and they are the organizations as Emmanuel listed here and many others who are able to rescue this surplus at scale and redistribute at scale. However, these organizations have also evolved as donors to themselves. So for instance, if one redistributor has one specific product in a large quantity, then there is a resource sharing also happening. Then they go and redistribute it to food aid service organizations that also Emmanuel mentioned. These are the smaller organizations who serve directly end consumers, whether it's a food banks, the community soup kitchens, and so on. But these organizations, along with receiving the food from food wholesale distributors, they also source the surplus from donors themselves. Mostly it's back of store collections in retail or hospitality sector or some other event venues and so on. They also complement the surplus food that they get with the non-surplus food purchase, because often they have their own budget. And then based on what surplus they get, they're able to also plan their purchases. And then finally, they serve the end recipient and customers through whether it's a food parcels, the pantries, the cooked meals, or so on. However, if that organization acts as a regional hub or the hub in their own area, then the redistribution further goes to other food aid service organizations within the network, who then serve the end consumer. So this is just simply the material flows, the surplus food flow, and not including the information or financial resource flow. So it is quite complex. And what we have found also is that what happens at the donor and donor redistributor relationship largely affects the usability of the surplus food at the end of the chain. In fact, this is a very highly perishable product that has to go quite a lengthy way in order to reach the end recipient. And in the previous slide, we saw the comment that one of the donor company is adjusting their packaging, breaking down their surplus into smaller quantities so that it can be redistributed to more. And we are finding it more and more through the interviews that if donors make specific adjustment, if there's an adjustment within the relationship of donor and redistributor, it can largely enhance the surplus food flows. So for instance, food aid service organizations, many of them are closed on Sunday. So if the wholesale redistributor gets the surplus of very highly perishable product on Friday, it does not really leave them much of the time window to rescue this food from the waste bin and turn it into a resource that can generate the value. As we already mentioned, food aid wholesale redistributors have evolved into the complex organizations, and they do manage multiple relationships, and they have the knowledge of resources and what's going on both upstream and downstream. And so along with the surplus food resource hubs, they have evolved into the knowledge and information hubs. And as one of the respondents from this large wholesale redistributor noted, coming from the commercial sectors, they've never seen so many stakeholders that have to be managed as customers. They have 4 immediate customer stakeholder groups that they have to satisfy, whether it's surplus food donors, financial donors, community partners, and the volunteers. And this is just also to show briefly like what are some of the main relationships that they have to manage. We have the food donors, and here we have the first tier and second tier donors. Second tier donors we refer to food donors who are the suppliers of the first tier donors that they are able to access through the relationships with the donors. Then we have the first and second tier food aid service organizations. We also have horizontally partner food wholesale redistributors financial donors, volunteers, third-party logistics providers. This is quite a big cost for the wholesale redistributors, digital platforms, of course, public institutions, and finally, we call it competitors, all the other organizations that are working on the food waste management options down the hierarchy, whether it's an animal feed or AD, because recently there is still a lot of food that is quite fit for human consumption and redistribution, but is still being sent to the anaerobic digestion or animal feed. So the food wholesale redistributors have them somehow to have to compete with them for the surplus food. And so what goes into the network? This is quite a complex network with complex relationships and interactions. Often by the respondents, the donation chain of food coming from the donors is referred as a surprise chain because first, there is a very limited information of where is the surplus, why there is a surplus, and what surplus is available out there. And whenever they get the surplus from the donors, they do not often know what is coming, in what quantities it's coming, and in what condition it's coming. So that of course complicates the planning of the wholesale redistributors. Then the question is like, what becomes of surplus, because donors do not often have much of the visibility on the journey of their surplus food and how it's being used. So basically, often our redistributors very much welcome of donors visiting their warehouses and going on the van rides, delivering this surplus to the smaller organizations, so they have the full visibility, and they often also see how the adjustments that they make, what impact and what value it can bring. Surplus food redistribution and management is never just the task of one department. So there are many different stakeholders which are involved in the process. And as one of the donor respondent has mentioned, unless you embed it into the operations and make it part of your daily routine, it simply just falls off. And it's not being made part of the embedded into operations and being part of the daily routine in many of the cases. Well, surplus food redistribution is not necessarily an easy solution and convenient solution, especially if you go and access the surplus food farther upstream, where you're dealing with food that is not simply packaged and readily available for redistribution. It takes a lot of resources to make that food first redistributable and then usable down the chain. So putting it in the waste bin is much more easier option, and also considering that how well developed the infrastructure for lower waste management options there are and what incentives that are available, it becomes even less easy option, and redistributors are trying more and more to become easy partners to work with. And then we have that keeping lights on because within the wholesale redistributors, financial, technical, organization capacity limitations are there, and it's very closely interlinked resources. So unless they have the finances available to keep the lights on in their warehouse, they can rescue and redistribute less surplus. And although there are the cases of resource sharing and knowledge sharing within the food wholesale redistributors, they are still competing for the donors, while at the same time, donors want to work with the less number of organizations. And then finally, again, what becomes of surplus down the chain, because often sometimes these food aid service organizations, they might not be knowledgeable of how to use certain surplus, and so there's sometimes this pushback of receiving and using that surplus, which then can create more waste into the whole operations. And now it's becoming more common to bring in the education element along with the redistribution of the surplus food, of how to use certain surplus, how to cook it into the meals and so on. So that allows wholesale redistributors to be able to redistribute more surplus down the chain. So we have found that building on the concept of industrial marketing and purchasing group, these three aspects of the business world discussed by the Hackinson scholars of variety, relatedness, and motion very well describes the surplus food redistribution landscape because of the variety of stakeholders and resources being involved, how they are very, very closely connected, and the dynamics that is going into the surplus food redistribution space. We find that interaction and relationship building is becoming a key factor. Because through the interaction and relationship building, food wholesale redistributors are able to access to more non-food support, whether it's a financial support from the donors or voluntary labor and so on. They're able through these relationships to access surplus further upstream. It can be the suppliers of the donors and their supply chain network in general. It helps to develop more knowledge about the resource, surplus food resource itself, and then get more visibility over the resources generally. This also allows there are the cases of joint learning and development opportunities. And then finally, these relationships lead to conversation, to adjustments. As one of the respondents mentioned, that because we had a very close relationship with the donor, we were able to go to them and ask them, can you make these adjustments, whether it's like provide more packaging or break down that surplus into smaller quantities. So through that, then they're able to use more effectively that limited technical and organizational capacity, generate less waste across the network, and then create more value from the surplus food itself. And then finally, another key factor that keeps coming up is the data, because these organizations are collecting the data from the various stakeholders and they are reporting to various stakeholders. So data accuracy is a key. And it's very important to have the digital systems in place because it helps to reduce the human error, considering that they're dealing with so much data, and also not having accurate data does hinder the data-driven decision making. And so for instance, digital emergence of the digital platforms is another layer that has been added to the traditional surplus food flows, and this has brought improvements in some sense, in a way that some of the donors, for instance, are not happy to display their surplus food numbers because it can be an indication of the inefficiencies, and so these digital platforms have brought some of the solution here in that area. However, there is much more opportunity of digitalization within this field, and that can bring a lot of benefits both at the organization as well as the government space. It can help in terms of operations optimization, such as transportation routing and use of spaces for charities, donors, and then as the AI, bringing in AI in the picture. There's not much research going on that yet available on the use of AI in surplus food distribution space. However, it has much of the opportunity in terms of identifying structural inefficiencies at the organization level as well as the government level, and then simulating different tax regimes or penaltying, and then evaluating its impact on the performance. So that covers basically it. To sum up the complexity of the redistribution network and the very high importance of the relationships and the data in order to address some of the key challenges going on in this space. I'll hand over to Michael next.
Or can be Carol, I don't mind.
I think it was me, but it's fine. So I think from the work that you've heard, we feel that there are actions that can be taken from three major stakeholder groups. We think there is a leadership role for government, both local and central governments, around providing legislation, regulation that can support intelligent food redistribution. And there are some really good examples out there. So France became the first country to pass a national law against food waste, which wasn't exactly a ban on food waste, but what it banned was that larger supermarkets could not voluntarily destroy edible food. And they had to find a way of repurposing it. And then a bit later on in 2019, that scope was extended to large food service operators and manufacturers. So to start to bring in the wholesale sector as well. logistics operators in France who provide free transportation services for donation delivery also could benefit from tax reductions. I think that's quite an interesting idea that we could implement relatively easily in the UK. And in Italy, there's another tax break, as it were. So companies can deduct, the value of donated items up to 10% of taxable income or 70,000 euros a year. So again, there are some models out there which could be really helpful to provide this sort of legislative framework. In terms of donors, I think more knowledge sharing is important, and provision of industry expertise to redistributors, and that's where there's sort of an interaction between the legislation and the incentives, if you like, and then being able to for donors to be able to operate in this way, and to do the sorts of things that Rusa and Emmanuel have been talking about in terms of being able to portion, package, store surplus food so that it reaches its end donation with a much better shelf life left on it. And then finally, for the redistributors, definitely opportunities for sharing resource sourcing and sharing resources themselves. We know that there are peaks and troughs in terms of donations. Pooling resources so that although an individual organisation might struggle with logistics, having a logistics programme that can span several organisations would be a really intelligent way to move forwards, and really to sort of promote this cooperative approach between wholesale and more consumer-facing organisations. So there are sort of some overlaps, I think, between the two presentations that you've heard today, and the role that wholesale can play. And actually the interactions between wholesale and retail don't happen very much at the moment, but I think offer a real potential for ensuring that more food is eaten at a form when it's got some shelf life left on it. I'm going to leave it there unless Michael has any additional comments, and I think we'd be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
No, that's absolutely fine with me, Carol. Thanks for helping.
Thanks, Carol. Oh, sorry to talk over you there, Michael. Thank you, Carol and Rusa and Emmanuel. We've got approximately 25 minutes left for questions. I have a few and hopefully people will contribute questions shortly, but I'd just like to invite all of the presenters to toggle their cameras on for this part. Might be nice to see some more faces and no more slides. Great. So if you just toggle your cameras on, guys, that'd be great. So I'll kick off with a question then. Now then, which to choose? So we've talked a lot about what food becomes surplus and the factors that govern that. But thinking when you were talking about technical innovations and AI and sort of digital innovations, just wondering what technical innovations show the greatest potential to reduce waste at scale. If anyone would like to come in, I think that's probably relevant to both teams' work.
I can quickly jump in if you wish.
Thanks, Jag.
Yeah. So we've been looking at digital platforms as you'll be familiar with our, the Uber, Airbnb general platform context, but partly what we've been looking at is in our wholesale market specific environment, technologies are rarely seen, so very little digitalization, let alone more advanced platforms. But as Ettore talked about, digital disruptors, and Nikolai was talking about all sorts of other interventions. And indeed, Aaron's doctoral work is all around digital technologies in agri-food supply chains. There's a myriad of productivity type interventions, but others that are more of the digital platform nature, where you start to get the network effects of sort of two-sided markets. So what can drive demand and what can drive supply, with the platform being an orchestrator.
Mm.
So the novelty there is what is almost entirely a physical infrastructure and a bit of a digital desert. Looking at how we introduce digital technologies and even think of it as a platform itself.
Thank you,
Okay.
Jag. Michael.
If I'm allowed to speak, I want to speak on behalf of the whole colleagues here, but I want to give, building on what Zach just said. For me, okay, the supply chain is not homogeneous because you have different supply chain members with different kind of infrastructure, with different kind of systems, and different kind of ability, financial ability to implement systems. So, okay, you can have the big retailers, the big manufacturers who have the financial muscle to implement all these systems and platforms. But in the rest of the food supply chain, I'm discussing about some food redistributors, which Emmanuel alluded to. Do they have this ability, financial ability, or technological understanding to do that? That's a big question for me. We see that in our work with different kind of supply chain members in different countries. There are many barriers. There are cultural barriers sometimes, there are organizational barriers, and there are financial barriers. So I wouldn't say that it's very difficult, but we have to appreciate that some parts of the food redistributor supply chain will be able to do that, others will follow. And of course, here the governments can chip in, and Carol did discuss about tax credits and opportunities. The government will provide some incentives for them to update and come to the same scale, to all speak the same technology in same platforms. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Anyone else to add to that? Just look while I look at the Q&A. Maybe while I'm if I ask another question and then I'll take a look at the Q&A. So I think you touched on it there about what government can do to support, Michael. But thinking about the wholesale markets and how essential they are, especially things like the pandemic happen, but also food distribution networks. So to what extent would it help if those were actually recognised as critical national infrastructure? And just thinking more broadly about the policy shifts that might be needed to support that.
If we may take the question?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so our first goal is actually to make sure that they do not collapse. So that's possibly the program minimum, because then we don't have an option for fresh produce. So then we miss we miss the source of fresh produce for the region, accessible food. For them, when we talk to tenants, they always reminded us that because of low margins, they have to sell in large volumes. It means that the food is very fresh. It brings lots of advantages that Ettore mentioned about, linking this to the organic food, to the ever-growing interest into quality of food ingredients. And as the most ideal situation, as kind of what we really want to implement, is that actually wholesale markets are recognized as a strategic asset, first of all, and that they actually hold, at any time, they hold a number of components, vital components, bringing vital nutritions to the food systems. Because if we remove wholesale market from the food system completely, most likely businesses will file replacements, but the replacements will be for poor nutrition value. And then in time, we might experience people need to buy vitamins or supplements, food supplements, because they miss vitamin C or they miss some other ingredient, some other important vitamins. So we increase pressure on NHS and on other systems, right? So I think currently we're in the state when we still can improve this. We can improve the food system before the negative implications start propagating to other.
Can I build on this if I'm allowed? And I mean, I guess let's say hidden in Nikolai's comment, there is a methodological conversation that I'm not sure we're having. So, we heard the colleagues talking about AI and, black box opaque models. So there is a tradition of getting, the geek in the basement churning the answer, trust me, came out of a computer, the answer is 7, on you go. Some of the slides we skipped on are more about making the model part of the conversation and the engagement with the decision maker. So the reality is things are complex. You heard in Nikolai's response, there are complex causality patterns that are difficult to grasp for decision makers, especially when they're at the strategic level. So we're not modeling for the sake of modeling, but to have a policy intervention, as Jack mentioned earlier, we need to bring to the fore and elevate certain perhaps counterintuitive dynamics that might occur as we intervene and alter the system. And so the methodological conversation, and this is part of the remit of RASC2AL, is to not just have a passive black box opaque modeling answer to that, but it's to bring the model to life in conversation with the decision maker. And it's not easy because you need to make an interface that is accessible. Also, you need to kind of take it down a notch as a pretentious academic. You can't just go, here's a bunch of differential equations, go solve them. And yet there are differential equations we were talking about, right? And introduces a layer of perhaps added burden for us to make a model accessible and usable to people who have no interest in actually engaging with model. And so I wonder whether the policy, the ability of informing policy rests on the ability to have a methodological conversation that makes models accessible and non-trivial causality patterns and behaviors of the system we're purporting to change might be made clear, or at least the assumption underneath can be made clear and interrogable, for lack of better jargon. So sorry, I went off on a tangent, but I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, that's great.
Can I come in a little bit? So, I mean, I guess I would say this is because FoodSEqual is sort of predicated on co-development. I think different solutions work in different places. So, particularly trying to reach communities that are in food deserts and so on. Perhaps a static wholesale market isn't going to turn the trade, particularly thinking about when it's not there in the first place to actually having it. We know that the uptake is slow, that there's a lag phase, and then as it becomes more acceptable and people get the idea that this is a great community neighborhood resource, but that sort of uncertainty period isn't very good from a business perspective. So I think this is where local policies can really play a part, that councils can dedicate spaces, but also think about alternative models where, we know up in Liverpool there's the Queen of Greens mobile veg van. That's a wholesale system, and it means that one business can go around and reach a greater footfall because they're mobile. And so I think I would think about, well, this is actually a role for things like food partnerships and local food action plans, is to work out what's right for your area and your community structures, and actually involve the community in that decision making. Because if they've requested it, then far more likely to engage with it.
I just wanted to connect that with the early conversation that you had in the Q&A with Jack, Carol, about maybe people just don't realise how, as you said, Queen of Greens is an example of a food wholesale model, but probably, as Jack says, reliance themselves on a wholesale market. And is it apparent to policymakers, to local and national levels, of those links and potentially the fragility of that if the hub, the wholesale market, disappears or goes elsewhere?
And the logistics of having to go large distances to get to that hub. It's some of you may have seen in the Q&A, our local Reading wholesaler has gone into liquidation this week. This is a family business that's been running for 50 years. And they were mostly providing into hospitals, schools, food service businesses, rather than operating markets where people would come to. But during COVID, they were fabulous because they put together parcels, they did deliveries, they ran markets that were safe during COVID, and they became an absolute anchor in the communities in Reading. But they can't make the business work. And we've seen ourselves that the hospitality sector is really, really struggling. And a lot of these smaller family businesses are being replaced by a few bigger organisations, I guess, that have the logistical power and tools to make it work. And so, the sorts of things that the Cambridge team have been talking about enabling smaller businesses to develop. And if we link that in with the kind of the policy base, how do we enable that entrepreneurship to grow? And what kind of support can we provide? Because it provides so much more than just a business for those people. It provides resource for communities. You were talking about the wider well-being implication. When people can actually access and afford a healthy, sustainable diet, then it has huge knock-on effects.
I think well, maybe just building on a couple of those great points, Carol. I think one is, just maintaining these before we lose them, which is part of the critical infrastructure comment you made, Tracey, which I think is super important. But on one of the slides, we talked about opportunities. So a modern day fresh produce wholesale market may look very different to what it does today. So, if we introduce those digital technologies, if we start to bring in the diversification in food, variety in services such as sorting, kitchens, servicing on-site and off-site dark kitchens, it becomes a really entrepreneurial and vibrant activity. And one word which I think we missed saying in our presentation, which was the essence of RASC2AL, was around cascade risks. So we sometimes say, oh, isn't it a shame that wholesale market, went, they're really good guys. But the points you were alluding to, Carol, about the downstream impacts of that is, you lose one of the channels into the urban environment, but also you are now making it even harder for the small retailer to survive in an increasingly modernized large retail market. But also one of the declining trends in the eat five a day is what's the role of wholesale markets within the affordable and nutritional food landscape. So I think those cascade risks of a declining or even a failing wholesale market is really, or should be, of major concern to policymakers.
Yeah, there's probably a piece of work to be done in parallel around making people confident to shop in those kind of environments. People are used to going to pick up a bag of carrots and 15 pence from Morrison's or whatever. And what we found when we were running our little pop-up stall in Reading is that people didn't know what a kilogram of anything looked like. And so typically on these markets, then things are sold per kilogram. And people go, what's that? They actually want a price per apple, a price per carrot, or a £1 bowl of something. And when you go down to Tower Hamlets markets, that's exactly what you see. And it's interesting sort of getting people confident and comfortable in that space. Should we pick up on a question that Sonish asked in the chat, which was around
I was going to say if we talk about consider both of those questions that have popped in. So the first one being about technological solutions, and that AI will need data as an input. So the question is, does the research show that the data is there and that it's available and that people hold that data, are willing to share it? And then if you want to consider this second question as well, what are the critical steps or roadmaps that both the teams might move these new models into pilot testing and deployment with the stakeholders that you've identified? So if you maybe want to take the one about data and AI first, if anyone.
A little bit, yeah. I was going to comment on the willingness to share bits, and Michael Emmanuel did quite a lot of work in this space, might want to come in on it. And certainly amongst retailers and food manufacturers, I think there is a willingness to share and a willingness to do, but we have to recognise they're not charities. So that, and then we come round the circle of we need policy incentives to drive that. I don't know whether Emmanuel, Michael, do you want to come in on that and comment more on the data side of things?
Go first, Emmanuel.
I absolutely agree with you, Carol. There has to be some form of incentivization with regards to that. Like you said, there are charities that are there are commercial organizations that are happy to do so, but I also think that we need to make the conversation around redistribution a little bit more. We need to be, I'm going to be a little bit blunt here, but we need to be a little bit more honest about what the situation is. There is surplus being generated. If people feel as if they are going to be berated for it, even if they're going to redistribute it, they're going to find alternative means by which it will not come onto their papers that indeed this is what has happened. What about if we change the conversation and say that we are actually going to appreciate you for the volume of your generated surplus that you actually redistribute for human consumption? Could that change the conversation, even while simultaneously we are looking at over time going to reduce the volume of preventable surplus that is being generated? If we can have those things simultaneously, then through policy incentivization, we could actually encourage more open and honest reporting, both of that which is generated and on the redistribution side, how much actually goes to the end consumer. And then that could also actually help with balancing the power, which is a challenge in the sector where, there is a lot of power on the commercial side and less so. But if the redistributors are going to act as sort of a check on what is happening on the donor side of things, then we could have more honest data and the conversation around it could be better than it currently is. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there if we become less critical and more encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, building on that, I think we're looking for two different perspectives here. One is the commercial supply chain. When data sharing is happening, but equally it's a cutthroat environment, very competitive. But equally, we're discussing about food distribution and a food aid supply chain, when it's not commercial, it's supposed to be more philanthropic, and therefore, personally, I couldn't see a major challenge for data sharing and use of AI to support this part of the food aid supply chain, because not commercial, it's not profit oriented, it's a very different kind of perspective. So here's the opportunity, I think, if that question, I heard that question nicely. Yep.
Cool.
And maybe just very, very quickly on the 2 points. I think it is a bit of an irony is where we need more data sharing. There's a bit of a data desert, and where there's lots of data, it's so competitive that data sharing is not the norm. There was a question earlier about when would we move this from pilot to deployment. One of the, I would say, most novel aspects of the work we're doing at Cambridge is we're trying to shape the strategy, and then they're not doing a pilot because the Cambridge guys are nice guys. They're bought into the strategy. We're not that nice, as it happens, but they've bought into that idea because it's been co-created, and they're implementing it. And then we can check, did we get the output that we expected? And it's that variance from our expectation that becomes an interesting contribution from a research perspective, that we expected this to happen. And we're already seeing a few counterintuitive outcomes. Lots of interventions may create a bit of complexity. They may compete with each other. They may detract from the core purpose of what a wholesale market is for example. So all the great ideas aren't so great necessarily. When we start to look at in our modeling environment, there's some interactions to consider, but we hope to test them, just to answer that question, in the real world environment, which is a bit of a challenge in a short 3-year project, because the ideation takes time, the co-creation takes time, and then trying to look at the data on implementation, it's quite tight. But we do hope to certainly have preliminary findings.
Fabulous, thank you. We've got 3 minutes left of the call, so apologies to Michelle that we won't be able to have time to answer your question, but I just wanted to go to the previous person who asked a question, which is a nice one to wrap up on. So I'll ask to Michael and Jag in particular. Wonder if there are any insights or messages that you felt were the most important points to make, and what you'd like people to take away from what has been presented today.
Jack, you want to make a start, or myself?
You go for it, Michael.
Okay, all right, okay. I think there are many. I mean, Carol did allude and provide some policy-related implications, which based on experience and lessons to be learned from other national environments, so can see that other European environments are advancing in that space. They have some great initiatives about tax credits, about donations, and how to support some food redistributors. That's one, let's say, big lesson to be learned. Equally, technology, which is huge, digitalization, supply chains, and it's an opportunity to consider with the barriers I alluded earlier on. There are some barriers as everywhere, but equally, the information, the data sharing is for me a huge opportunity, especially that supply chain, because as I did say, we don't have, let's say, commercial sensitivity. We try to be philanthropic, we try to support disadvantaged consumers, deprived consumers, so it's a huge opportunity to get that right. And if we do, we're dealing with something we say of a monumental importance. And that's what we're here all today, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jag, final word from you then, please.
Yeah, always like to have the last word. Wholesale markets are critical infrastructure. We need to look after them. Disruptions are opportunities for reinvention. And final point is co-creating with stakeholders. Make sure our research is in the real world and relevant. Those would be my 3 takeaways.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing us nicely on brand with the TUKFS programme, which, as you know, is all about how do we transform food system, and co-creation being at the heart of all of the research that we've been doing the past 5 years. Thank you to all of you speakers for your time and for sharing your insights. It's a massive part of the food system that I think within the programme we haven't explored too much, apart from obviously your streams of work, but it's critical, and probably we need to unpick more how it connects in with other parts of the system, as we've touched on today. So yes, hopefully we have shared insights on how these systems can evolve to more flexible, equitable and resilient business models. So thank you very much. I hope to see you all soon.